Hi everyone, Adrian Groenewald, Global Leadership Platform. It's great to be with you. Our usual Global Leadership Conversation series, and this is the first one that we're having with leadership experts, opinion leaders all over the world, influencers, to try and understand the global leadership crisis. Where do we come from? How do they define it? And what do they think the top qualities are that we need in order to overcome this global leadership crisis? It really is a great challenge that we're trying to solve. So with me today, I've got all the way from Pretoria, the capital of South Africa, Francois du Plessis, Group CEO of inavetiQ. And for many years, him and his team have been working with senior leaders in organizations, not just here, but internationally. He's got strong views about leadership. I'm going to ask the standard questions to Francois. Welcome, Francois.
Thank you. Thanks, Adrian.
It's great to have you with us. Give us some of your time. We really appreciate it. Okay, Francois, that's the crisis. Here are the three questions. But first, for the context, how would you define or describe the global leadership crisis?
I mean, I think in the earlier conversation, Adrian, that we had, you made a statement that no one's been able to refute, your statement that there is a global leadership crisis. And I'm not surprised. To that. I think the overall crisis is definitely a more systemic one. My sense is that we tend to, in thinking about leadership, often highlight the leader. And I think it goes beyond the leader. It definitely is a leadership issue. And in leadership, that refers to, I think, if you think about communities of leaders, whether they exist in organizations or in government or in, wherever they exist, it definitely is a community issue. And therefore, I think the comment around leadership versus leader is an important one to understand. Also, when one talks about the leadership crisis, I think overall, globally, I think there's probably two issues. I think, at least from my perspective, that we see in working with leadership in organizations is two issues. I think one of leadership ego, and the second of empathy, I think, of leaders. And it seems that those two, if you want to call them qualities or drivers in leadership, are things that I, at least as a new issue, are seeing more and more.
Okay.
More and more of.
Okay. So we have a global leadership crisis. You think at the heart of it might be ego and lack of empathy. So I'm interested then in, what do you believe is the most important quality or attribute we need to develop or awaken or improve in leaders if we are going to somehow solve this global leadership crisis? What do you put at the top?
Yeah. And again, I think there's more than one characteristic or element. I think if I had to choose one, it would be, I think, empathy. And it's not empathy in the sense, I think when people hear qualities like empathy, they tend to think that they are soft qualities, and that they make leaders soft leaders. And I don't think it's that. I think it's empathy in the context of, leaders really understanding contextually what's happening globally, contextually understanding what's happening socially, and being able to understand what that means within their context. I think all of the drivers of change currently globally, whether it's technology, whether it is changes in political space, all of those have one consequence, which is a massive social consequence to countries and to organizations as social systems. And I think for leaders to be able to understand that implication and engage with that environment with empathy, and empathy in terms of understanding, I think will go a long way in terms of then informing also decision making and behavior going forward. So if you ask me to list only one, it would probably be empathy for now. And I think it touches on what I mentioned earlier on ego also, because if leaders are driven by personal ego, in other words, what it is I can achieve, I think then empathy almost sits at the periphery of decision making. Whereas if it's a very strong, let's call it an internal locus, if you want, where there's very little ego in leadership. There's much more space, I think, for empathy in leadership and decision making.
Francois, interesting as you mention empathy with the context that you've now given is when we say empathy, we immediately assume it only means I have empathy for you as a human being in my interaction with individuals almost. But I almost hear you say something like a societal empathy, a contextual empathy. It's an overall mindset that ultimately then does come down to the empathy I feel for you as my employee or for you as my employees, and for human beings. But am I right in saying you're trying to describe something bigger? Do I have an overall empathy for women being abused or discriminated against in our society that we've had in South Africa a lot of late? Or do I have an overall empathy for poor people, poverty-stricken individuals who can't get out of that, or for weak education, which ultimately comes down to people? But you know what I'm saying? Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. So it is obviously, empathy at a very fundamental level between you and me as individuals and human beings, but it is much greater than that. It is a much bigger understanding of what's happening, especially in the social space, and having empathy for what that means for organizations, for people, for teams, so definitely at a much broader level.
Okay. Well, for me, I might be slow or something, but for me, that's a bit of an aha moment. Is fine empathy for the individual that I'm talking to right now in a meeting, but societal empathy, going broader, it's an amazing thing. Because everything impacts everything in today's world. How do you best develop, awaken, or improve this quality of empathy in people? Our leadership development industry is a multi-billion-dollar industry. Do we know how to train leaders? So why do we train them? Let's say if empathy is at the top and we're spending so much money in training, coaching, is it going to lead to improved empathy? So are we driving at the heart of the problem? How do I develop leaders?
I guess if we had the answer, it would be an easy thing to solve. I think there's a few things, and part of it also talks to belief, I think, Adrian. I think generally women have more empathy. I think they're much more tuned with empathy, not only at an individual level, but much broader. So I think potentially one way is to support women in leadership more, and not only in organisations but also governmental. I've been following the Prime Minister of New Zealand, and I have much respect for the work that she's doing. And I think if you look at just the nature of her decision making, the nature of her engagement, you can see the societal empathy there. No, that's not a development solution. I think the issue around leadership development lies also potentially in the way that we approach it. I think we tend to think about leadership development as a very technical solution. So what's the process that we need to follow? What's the program that we need to teach people? How do we develop the leader? And I think we need to. I think good process, good technical solution is important, but I think it's also combining that with a stronger social solution, if you want, where we don't develop the leader, but we try and develop the leadership community, for example. We try and develop more cohesiveness between leadership and leadership teams. We try and get more coherence between and amongst leaders and leadership teams. So I think our development approach potentially globally is one more of formal and very technical, as opposed to maybe a bit more informal or non-formal, if you want, where we try and build really, elements around cohesiveness, alignment, community. So I think maybe fundamentally I would rethink, if one thinks about leadership development, our approach to trying to develop leaders.
Okay.
Because I don't know if you think, if you take something like empathy, whether it is in fact something I can teach you. So I've not seen leadership programs that teach empathy. But I have seen empathy develop, nurture, and grow where leaders have come together as leadership teams, as leadership communities, and discuss these issues and unpack these issues and learn from one another what this means. And again, there, I think the ego plays a very important role in this, because I need to be open as a leader and as leadership to be willing to learn, to be willing to be vulnerable also in a process of learning. I would, again, if I had to do one thing from a leadership development perspective, is really rethink our approach and move away from all of the formal leadership development programs and initiatives and approaches that we have.
So it's more creating more interaction, more exposure, more understanding, which then increases potentially empathy, in that sense.
Yes, and I think with changes globally now, and I mean, we all know the rate of change. I think it's enough said about rate of change. That I think in our approach to developing leaders and leadership, a formal approach I don't think can keep up with change. But I believe really that's where leaders learn, and where leaders learn the fundamentals of leadership is in these interactions, is in this community process, or building leadership communities as a process, if you want, of leadership. I think those are really valuable at a leadership development level. And again, I mean, leadership doesn't refer to only the top leaders in organization. I think it refers to everyone. Everyone in a way is a leader, whether it is at home, whether it is in a team, whether it is in the organization, whether it is in their community. And they all bring those lessons into potentially such a journey around building leadership community. So I think those are really powerful processes, if you want.
Francois du Plessis, Group CEO of, I want to get this right, interesting name, inavetiQ. Thank you for joining us on our Global Leadership Conversation series for the Global Leadership Platform. And, what we asked leaders last second, just to emphasize the global nature of our conversation, we asked them to tell us something interesting about the city that they live in. When people come to South Africa, they kind of pop over to Cape Town and Kruger National Park, and they often skip the middle cities. But what's interesting about Pretoria, it is the capital, isn't it? And therefore, what makes it interesting? Jacarandas.
Yeah, so obviously, as you said, it is the capital. I think maybe not on interesting so much, but what makes it really beautiful are the jacarandas. And we're now going into jacaranda time again. I can remember as a student studying at University of Pretoria, it was one of the greatest times of the year was when the jacarandas were in bloom, because it's spectacular. It's like nothing else you'll see anywhere else in the world. So I think the jacarandas are definitely a unique point to Pretoria.
Standout point. Francois du Plessis, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate you getting your voice out there. We really do.
Thanks, Adrian. And good luck with all the good work you're doing.
Thank you so much. All the best. Bye.
Bye.